It's Aurélie Berthet. She lives and researches in Lausanne, University of Lausanne, holds a senior researcher position. Her expertise is exposure sciences, especially focusing on passive smoking and new tobacco products. So I think you are the right person for us to tell us the latest news about the toxicology of the new products. Please, Aurélie.
Yes. Okay. So thank you for our award for this the organization of this symposium, and I will just present you the toxicology of ENDS, ENDS for electronic nicotine device system, and I will use this word for all the presentation. So first, I will do a brief introduction, and after I will present ENDS characteristic and use and how they can affect the composition of the emission of ENDS. We will see afterwards a few chemicals we can measure in the aerosols, and we finish with the uptake nicotine with ENDS. So for the short overview, what we found in the scientific literature, hence, all the studies show that hence aerosol is far less toxic than tobacco cigarette exposure, and it's really due to combustion process and lower temperature to heat the nicotine. Evidence also shows that when you heat the e-liquids, it could generate some new components and a certain level of toxicity, and this is what we will see in this presentation. But the data on toxicity is very limited, and no really risk assessment studies this. They also have lots of inconsistency in the results and on the compound release, and it's mainly due to the differences used in the design of the methods or the models that the studies used. Anyway, for the health effect, hence aerosol is water soluble, so it's likely to be deposited in the zone of the airways, and a small amount can also reach the alveolar region. But in the literature, you don't have any evidence on a long-term effect, and it's really lacking. And just to see what are the characteristics and the use and how they can affect what you found and what you're exposed to toxicants. I will show you here, as you know, all the hands are made with a clearomizer and a battery. So when you turn on the battery, you will influence the power and the voltage, and some device, depending on the brands of the design, you can change this. And this will influence also the heating coils, how we will heat and how we will heat the e-liquids. The e-liquids itself is also a different composition, depending on the brands you can use. And finally, you have the user who can also, with the puff profile, change the heat temperature or the chemical composition. So here, just to present the main compounds of the e-liquids. So you have humectants, mainly propylene glycol, glycerol, and sometimes lots of fewer of ethanols. You can have or not nicotine, water, and flavoring agent. In the flavoring agents, it's more than 7,000 flavoring agents on the market. It's all chemicals, synthetic chemical, and when they heat, it emits aromas. The concern with this agent is it's approved for ingestion, but they are not tested for inhalation. So we don't have lots of data on health effects when we're exposed to this by inhalation. Just a few words for humectants and solvents, so propylene glycol and glycerol. This is really the base of e-liquids. They help to dilute nicotine, and they allow the e-liquid to easily vaporize. And they will also affect the ratio. The ratio will affect the nicotine delivery and the cloud formation from the user. The puffing profile also something or a parameter very important to consider, and it may affect the concentration. The main, there are several variables, but the main we'll have to take into account is the number of puff, the puffing duration, or the interval between each liquid is heated up, the puff intervals, which is when the break between two puffs, the puffing intensity, which is a combination of the puff inhaled, the puff frequency, and the heating voltage, and also the total puff volume. And of course, the profile will vary depending on the brands and depending on the user, if it's experimented or not. So what we found in the aerosol, what is the composition of these aerosols? More or less, you can have 250 chemical substances which could be detected in the aerosols. And it's for several compounds, there are a high correlation between their concentration and the power at which the ends operate. So it implies that a liquid ingredient might be chemically altered during the vaporization process. So you will find anywhere the propylene glycol and the glycerol, which is not very known about the health effects. The most common symptom reported by user is dry mouth and throat. But there are no really information on long exposure effect to propylene glycol or glycerol. Really, the primary concerns for the composition is the carbonyls. Carbonyls is acetaldehyde, formaldehyde, acrolein. This is really the main components, and you probably is quite well known because it's a pollutant that you can find everywhere in your environment. They are maybe measured in traces in e-liquids, and they are important because they can cause irritation to the respiratory tract, but they're also potential carcinogens. Formaldehyde is classified group 1 or carcinogen in humans by York, and acetaldehyde is a potential carcinogen for humans. So how we can explain all this variation in carbonyl concentration? So when you have the e-liquid heated by the coal, you will generate carbonyls. And the main source is the propylene glycol and the glycerin. So here in the graph below, you can see the propylene glycol and the glycerin on your right. And when it's in contact with the heating coal, propylene glycol will form acetaldehyde, while glycerin will form acrolein. But glycerin will also form glycerol, and by oxidation, you will have formaldehyde. And when the temperature of the coal is very high, glycerol can also produce acrolein and acetaldehyde. So this is the main source of carbonyls. But you also have other factors. So the battery or the voltage at which you will operate will also affect the concentration. More your voltage is high, and more you will have concentration of these compounds. If the temperature of the coal is above 300 degrees, it will also increase concentration. And if you have low e-liquid levels in your tank, it will also produce overheating and increase the concentration of carbonyls. If you use several times your hands, it will also increase the concentration. And some study shows that up to 60% of increase of carbonyl. And finally, you also have the flavoring. You can play a role. I will illustrate that with some graphic. So here it's a study from Slayman and al. 2016, and they study the voltage, the impact of voltage on the concentration of acrolein in yellow, in acetaldehyde, in green and in formaldehyde in black. And as you can see here, more your voltage is high and more you have these three compounds. This graph shows also that more you increase your voltage and more you will use e-liquid by mass. So here it's just to show you for the device aging. So if you use once or if you use 9 times, it will also increase the concentration of the three compounds. Here is another study from Kosmader et al. 2014, and it's about solvents. So if you use in triangle only glycerin, or in circle only propylene glycol, or in square a mix of the two, and they study the influence of the effect on the formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, and acetone. And as you can see on the three graphs, each time you increase the voltage each time, except maybe for the glycerin, for the formaldehyde, otherwise it increases each time the concentration. And the asterisk is just an indication of the statistically significant increase compared to 3.2 volts. Here it's a study from Fasolinos and Woodruiz, and it's just to show you that the flavoring agent also contributes to the carbonyls concentration. So this is the three compounds that they detected in the study, no other ones. And you have here 60% of PG and 40% of BG and 1.2% nicotine. This is the content of e-liquids. And you also have the voltage for the device used. And for unflavored, which is the first line of the table, you see the concentration for formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, and acrolein they obtain. And after, you have when they had some aromas inside, and you can see for each time its concentration of the three compounds is increasing. And when they had much more sugar inside, it's also increasing more. But you see, we know that we can detect formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, acrolein, but we have to know if it's important or not, if our health can be harmful for our health. So the same study, Fasolinos and Woodruiz, tried to compare what they obtained for this as a concentration for these three compounds. So you have the value in red on the graphs for the three different compounds, and they try to compare with a reference value. So for formaldehyde in microgram per day, so they try to differentiate to consider for 1 day, because generally the guidelines are for 1 day. So for the formaldehyde, they compare with the commonly measured indoor levels established by WHO. And as you can see, if you consume 5 grams e-liquids for 24 hours, it's less than the commonly measured indoor levels. And it's the same for acetaldehyde. They compare with the European indoor air quality guidelines, but as it was very high, they tried to compare also with the commonly measured indoor levels in the Europe. And even if we closed for 24 hours, we're quite lower than this concentration. And finally, for acrolein, they compare with the occupational exposure limits from NIOSH in the US. And also we can see the difference is quite low, it's quite high between the two. So after the carbonyls, the second concern is really the flavoring agent, because little information on the health effects during long-term and even from the short-term exposure by inhalation is known. So some of them are sensitizing, irritating, and toxic. Here I just give two examples. So diacetyl is very associated with the adverse respiratory health outcome. And cinnamaldehyde, that you can find in different fruity flavors, was shown to be cytotoxic and genotoxic even at low concentration in vitro studies. With flavoring, you also have saccharides to do the sweet flavors, and it could degrade in aldehydes as we saw previously, but it's also in furans. Furans is an irritant to the upper respiratory tract, and it generally correlated with the power of the device and the sweetener concentration, but it doesn't seem to be correlated with the puff duration. I don't want to spend too much time on the VOC for volatile organic compounds because they are very present in low concentration. And normally you don't have any in the e-liquids. And it's mainly depending on the flavor that you have in your e-liquids. Anywhere there you can find it with much lower concentrations than the carbonates. But I would like to highlight that you also have metals in the e-liquids and in the emission. So e-liquids, metals, you can find it and detect it in the e-liquids, but you can also, it's transferred via the metallic coal used to heat the e-liquids, but also from other parts of the e-cigarette device. And you often detect the chromium, nickel, lead, manganese, aluminum, tin, and iron. And I put in bold the most, for chromium and nickel, they are potential carcinogenic metals, and manganese, it's also, they could have neurotoxic effects. And in the graph below, it's just to show you that you have 5 different brands with 5 different colors. And this study measures acetal, measures the chromium, the manganese, the nickel, and the lead in these different brands. And as you can see, it's you have concentration. You have lots of variation between the brands, but also within the brands. As you see, for the box plot is very large. So finally, before to conclude, I would like just to show you the nicotine intake using hands. So in the nicotine content can be very variable. So it's depend on the product characteristics. So it depends on the brand of your device, but also the e-liquids you will use. The nicotine concentration in aerosol will increase with the power of the cold temperature, the voltage you will use, the e-liquid the nicotine inside the e-liquids, the puff duration, and if the pH of e-liquid is alkaline. For the nicotine intake from ants, lots of several of studies show that the intake is comparable to smokers from combustible tobacco cigarettes. And the graph you can see below, it's the results that we obtained in a previous study, a pilot study from ants clinical trials that Professor Retower will present you after me. And it just show you the concentration of nicotine in plasma in 2 groups. So we have the smokers groups and the ants user groups. So each group came 2 times at your labs. And the first time for the smokers, they smoke a cigarette. And then the second time they vape with the Inokin Endura. So they don't have choice for the device. They have to use the one we give them, sorry. And so they vape at 3 milligrams per milliliter nicotine. And we have the second group with the ants users only, and they have to come 2 times. And once they vape low levels of nicotine, and the second time a high level of nicotine. And as you can see, there are lots of difference for the levels of nicotine for the end users, and quite a lot for the smokers when they smoke or when they use ends. And with the ends user can obtain intake nicotine quite almost the same time than one for smokers. So to conclude, nicotine intake is comparable to tobacco cigarettes. Hence, aerosol is far less toxic than tobacco cigarettes, but you still have some potential harmful toxicants in the emission and aerosol. And to limit the exposure to these toxicants is really important to accurately set up the ENS parameters and to select appropriate device and e-liquids. And I would like to thank you for your attention, and if you have some questions.
Thank you very much, Aurélie, for this nice overview of also showing us the difficulties really to measure the toxicology of these end products, as you showed us that there is a lot of confounding, a lot of determinants really influencing the toxicology. We will, together with Reto Aur, also address some of these questions, but maybe we are aware that ENS is not a placebo, so it's obvious that we can measure some toxic products, but obviously, as you showed in one nice study, there is less toxic air pollution than in comparison to a normal indoor air pollution. And there is one question from the audience to this study, this 5 grams of liquid, which was compared with this normal indoor air pollution. Is this a realistic or representative amount being smoked by an end user?
It's very good to this study. I don't know. It's for sure. It's just an example of one study, and they use one device with specific parameters. So maybe if someone else do the same thing, they will get something else. So just to give an idea of with a quite recent device, how much we are in the concentration in the air, or what exposure for these 3 compounds. But for sure, if you look in the literature, there are other data, and they are not so restrictive, and they're more close from guidelines.
Okay, thank you. So